to the fairies, and I'm going to read you the Fairyland Fair. Bit of a tongue twister, that wasn't it? So I'm going to page 73. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'd love to get some feedback on what you all think about the stories. So 70. Really good, a minute. Okay, the Fairyland Fair. Again, there's no pictures in this one, so get your listening ears out today. This one's a little bit longer, so hope we can enjoy this nicely together. Okay. Okay, so if you're all ready, we're going to start. So sometimes the fairies all over the world seem to be in a flutter. If you close your eyes when you're out in the countryside, you may see them flittering here and there, looking busier and more excited. That's because it's fairy time in the Fairyland Fair. The Fairyland Fair is a wonderful event. All the fairies that can possibly manage it come along. And that's a lot of fairies in fairy time. The fair lasts for 3 days, but in human time, this is only about 3 minutes. So humans do not usually notice the fairies have disappeared for a little while. Since most humans never see a fairy in all their lives, very few people know about the Fairyland Fair. I thought you might like to share this fairy secret. Be careful who else you tell, won't you? Now, the Fairyland Fair is like human fairs, and in lots of ways, but the other ways it is very different. There are stalls and sideshows. Fairies love to play games, like knock the poppy head off the turnip, or find the hidden mustard seed. There are fairy ground rides too, with the dearest little swing boats made from peanut shells and roundabout with hanging hazelnut shells to sit in it. Of course, only fairies can fit all the way in the rides, which is for one reason why only fairies are invited. It came as a shock to the fair committee, chaired by Mother Nature, one year to find that several little elves had been caught disguising themselves as fairies in order to attend the Fairyland Fair. In fact, no one would ever have discovered this at all if at all one elf had not been found sleeping under the guess the weight of the acorn. She'd already changed back into her elfin clothes, but her fairy disguise was laying beside her. Just a minute, you will say. Elves don't look anything like fairies. They have pointed ears, for one thing, and absolutely no wings at all. Well, that's true, but when an elf has a sweet little fairy cap on with sky blue petals and is wearing a cloak of green velvet, it's hard to tell that he or she is not a fairy. You may be wondering too why it should matter that the elves attending the Fairyland Fair. There is, I'm afraid, a history of coolness between elves and fairies. It started when elves were heard saying to the fairies, "We're silly. Now, like me, you have probably met my great many elves who are much, much more sillier than any fairy in the world." But that is not how elves see it. Just as they have always thought that goblins are fierce and a little bit frightening, they have always considered fairies to be silly and not very clever. And this is just how it goes, to show how careful you must be to find out if what you hear about a person is true or just a story. For goblins are not in the least bit fierce, and fairies are some of the cleverest people I ever know. For a long time in her early days, Mother Nature tried to be friendly with the elves. She hoped they might help her in her work, but elves are more interested in their own lives and customs. They do not care for nature, as fairies do. In fact, even goblins are better informed about how the world works than elves are. That is why goblins often make very good doctors, and even fairies call upon them if they are ever sick or very hurt. And that is the only thing about elves and fairies that they have in common. For elves too use goblin doctors whenever they need them. And what do fairies think of elves? Well, of course, no one likes to know what someone thinks, if they are stupid or silly, Fairies are fairies do not unnaturally resent the unthinking views of most quiet elves. Quite often the elves talk most frequently about the silliness of the fairies, and that the very same elves that have never had any in their lives met anyone like this. When she heard that the elves had been visiting the Fairyland Fair, Mother Nature did not know what to do. She was a dear and friendly old lady, as you know, and she would have liked to have invited all the elves who wanted to come, and goblins too for that matter. But Mother Nature also knew that where lots of elves are gathered together, there is often trouble. And last thing Mother Nature wanted at the wonderful Fairyland Fair was any kind of commotion or difficulty. In view of this, a notice was put up on a tree on the outskirts of the fair. So there's a little notice which says, Fairyland Fair, fairies only, elves not welcome, by order of the Fair Committee. So Mother Nature is making it very clear that this is only for elves. So I wonder if this is only for fairies, so I wonder if any more sneaky elves sneak in, because we had a little elf who had a costume on pretending to be a fairy. Now this notice was not very friendly. It might have been better if someone had explained to the elves why they were not welcome. As it was, they took one look at the notice and declared that they wanted nothing to do with such snooty fairies. Such a notice, they said, had only proved how silly fairies were. For any fair at which elves were present was bound to be superior to fairies' only event. Mother Nature was not happy about the notice either, but she could not think of anything else to do. She could not bear to think of there being any trouble at Fairyland Fair. Strangely enough, it was this very notice that had ended the bad feeling between the elves and the fairies. It happened like this. Fairies on the whole do what they are told by Mother Nature. They are not argumentative by nature, and they feel happiest when they are helping another living creature. Elves, on the other hand, will argue at the drop of a hat. The first sign of any disagreement, they will call in an elfin meeting. This gathering gives everyone a chance to put forward his or her views, but the disadvantage is that the meeting can last for days, and at the end of it, the elves are often no further forward than they were at the very beginning. This is why, when a little elf called Berry saw the notice, he decided at once to ignore it. Berry was a very nice little elf who did his very best. He tried when someone told him not to do something. His elfin nature made him want to rebel. I will go to the fair, he said to himself, and went at once to find a disguise. As I said before, it is not too difficult to disguise yourself as a fairy. If you wear a hat, a cloak, and that is exactly what Berry did, but he had forgotten that the cloak must be the very long one, for elfin's feet are very much larger than fairy ones. Not realising that his feet were showing, Berry strolled through the fair until he came to a stall selling fresh vegetables. Elves were very fond of vegetables, especially carrots. So Berry stopped and looked at what was on display. However, it was not long at all before Berry's attention strayed from the vegetables, and he fixed on the lovely young fairy who was looking after the stall. She was the most beautiful little creature that Berry had ever seen. He listened as she spoke to her customers and soon realised that she was a very merry, clever little fairy. A clever little fairy. Berry felt that something was wrong somewhere. Everyone knew that fairies were silly, didn't they? But the more he realised that the fairies are just as lively and as intelligent as any elf, and perhaps more so than some. It wasn't long either before Berry realised that this little fairy had noticed him. She spoke kindly to him, which made Berry stammer and blush and fall over himself. The little fairy laughed, and her tinkling voice made Berry's heart turn over. He stayed by the stall all afternoon, occasionally buying vegetables, so that he did not look too conspicuous. By the end of the afternoon, the little fairy found that she had liked her very young visitor very well, and Berry found that he needed a wheelbarrow to take home all the vegetables he had bought. So there's a picture there. Berry took a shine to the fairy and bought too many vegetables, it seems. Next morning, bright and early, Berry returned to the fair. He was determined to ask the clever little fairy, whose name he knew was Primrose, if he could see her after the fairy fair had finished, which was the very next day. Primrose blushed when Berry asked the question. "I don't know," she said. "I've never had a friend who was an elf before." How did you know?" stammered Berry, blushing to the roots of his hair. Primrose looked down at Berry's feet and smiled. "Those aren't fairy feet," she said, shaking her head in fun. The next day, Berry and Primrose did meet, and the day after that, and the day after that. They soon realised they would very much like to be married, but such a thing had never been heard of before. Primrose decided that the best thing would be to talk to her mother Nature, who understood so many things and might have an answer to this difficult problem. When the two young people stood before her, Mother Nature smiled. It was so obvious that they were happy together. Berry had taken off his fairy disguise, so it was clear that he was an elf. "How can I help you, my dears?" asked Mother Nature, although in fact she already knew perfectly well. "We should like to be married," said Primrose and Berry, "but we are afraid that our families will not be happy. What shall we do?" "Why, you must talk to them," said wise old Mother Nature. "You, Berry, must show Primrose's family what a fine, upstanding elf you are, with good prospects, and every hope for giving your wife a happy and comfortable life. You should mention that you love her too, of course. And you, Primrose, you must show Berry's family that fairies are not silly creatures, and that they believe them to be. And you should mention that you love him too." "We will," said the young couple. Well, it took a long time to convince both families, but at last they agreed that the young couple should be happily married. The wedding, which at first was planned to be a small affair, grew and grew until practically everyone in Elftown and all the local fairies were invited. It was a wonderful party. Nowadays, the fairies and elves all remember that it was the wedding of Berry and Primrose that was they really saw each other without listening to a lot of silly stories and prejudices. That fairies are clever and elves are kind became clear for all to see. Nowadays, so many elves and fairies have set up home together that it is no longer wondered at. Berry and Primrose are very happy together, and they have 3 little children who share all the best features of elves and fairies. And each year the whole family goes to Fairyland. The notice outside has changed. So this notice now says, "Fairyland Fair. Everyone welcome by order of the Fairy Committee." So I've got my tongue tied a little bit there, but that was the Fairyland Fair. And that was a fantastic story. I really, really, really enjoyed sharing that with you. And that's just kind of demonstrating that we all have differences and that maybe we're not always accepted into people's society and certain groups. But it just shows that we've all got similarities as well as differences, and that we can all get along well together if we compromise and cooperate with each other. So hopefully you can take that story away and look at it and see that even though people may look different, we're all just as equal as each other. So I'm getting a bit dark in the light here, so I'm going to turn you right a little bit. There we go. There we go. So thank you very much for watching. This is the last day of Merlin Unicorn's Storytime, Magical Storytime Bonanza. I'm Louise Winstanley and from Peace and Presents, and I've enjoyed sharing some fantastic magical stories with you. So I'm going to be hopefully doing some more stories over the upcoming weeks. If you've got any suggestions of any stories that you would like me to share, then please send me a message. Let your children ask the question about what they would like to hear. If they've got a favourite fairy tale, I'd love to share that. I'm also going to post these stories on YouTube, so that you